have learned a lot, and more importantly, I hope that you have been able to hear God's voice in the voices of our various speakers and presenters of our breakout session. For this session, we're calling it the Talkback. Originally, when we were going to have a live delegation here, this was going to be the opportunity for that delegation to interact with the three keynote presenters, our three main guests for this Racial Justice Summit. But since we have had to pivot in so many different ways during this climate of COVID, we're doing this a little different. And I pray that this process, this talkback, still will be just as meaningful and informative to you as we have planned it to be. And so for the next 70 minutes or so, we are going to hear from our three keynote presenters. We will hear from Major Dr. Marion Platt. We also will hear from Dr. Cleveland, and we will hear again from Dr. Ra. Thank you three for agreeing to be a part of this talkback, and we have quite a few questions for the three of you. I will go through the questions, and for those that I would like all three of you to answer, I will say so at the beginning of that question. And then if it's directed to Dr. Cleveland or Dr. Ra or Major Marion, then I will also say that as well. And so welcome everyone to this talkback, where we get the pleasure and the privilege of hearing directly and having three incredible individuals who have been in this fight for justice of all types for a long time to talk to us and bend our ear and share from their wealth of knowledge. And so, with no further ado, let me get started with the very first question. This first question is for all three of our guests. And I'd like, if possible, to go in this order: Major Marion, Dr. Christena, and then Dr. Ra. And the question is, from the perspective of an officer and from two of you who are external to the Army, I don't know if I can claim that totally for Dr. Ra, but are external to the Army, the question is, how can we do better in the Salvation Army? What are the ways in which you've seen where we have fallen short, missed the mark, and what advice or you have for us where we can do better, and in what ways? Major Marion.
Okay. Well, thanks for that question and for mentioning that Dr. Ra is almost one of us. I think, Dr. Cleveland, if you accept one more speaking gig, you're in. So I think from an insider, one of the things that I notice is that the policies and the practices for appointments, and this is something that I've written about in some research that's been shared, deserve some attention. I mean, whatever we can do to ensure that those practices are standard and they are clear, so that folks understand what is expected of them and what are the standards of performance that need to happen when it comes to the selection of men and women for appointments. If those policies and procedures and practices had been more clear and, dare I say, equitable, if we would have frisked them for equity years ago, then we would probably have more minorities in leadership. If we had frisked ourselves for affinity bias, for things that smack of cronyism, or the promotion of one's friends and family, it would I believe that, looking after those policies and procedures would have helped us to be a lot farther by now to have a more inclusive and diverse optic at the leadership table. And so that's something that, again, I do a lot of thinking and speaking and responding and defending about. And I believe that would help us to do better. We should have done it a long time ago, but I think now is definitely the time for that. That would be the first thing. And the second is, the Army has a rich heritage in anti-racist work. Not every church movement can say that around the turn of the century. As in the United States during the Reconstruction era is when the Salvation Army arrived on the scene. 3 years after the Compromise of 1877. And when the Salvation Army came to the United States and started spreading throughout the nation, the Army was very vocal about the inclusion of Black men and women into its ministry. It did not equivocate. It did not apologize, and it took some heat for that. And I love that part of my history, but I never heard it until I went looking for it myself. I had to go in archived writings and research papers from people who are long dead to find this. And I feel like we can and would have done better if we would talk a little bit more about that. And so those are just two of my observations and suggestions. There's not a whole lot of detail to those suggestions, but my observations is, to make sure that we have transparent practices for the promotion, the appointment system, and also that we celebrate more our great legacy of anti-racist work in the early days of the Salvation Army in the United States.
Thank you. Dr. Cleveland.
I'm just going to speak to that. Overnight, I received dozens of messages on social media and via email from people who are members of the Army in some capacity, just thanking me for what I shared and lamenting that there are lots and lots and lots of people who are racist, who are in the organization. And so I think holding those people accountable from profile pictures, it seems that it's all Black and brown people who reached out to me, and I believe in believing Black and brown people. And so if they're saying a lot of folks around that we work with are racist, a lot of pastors in the Army are racist, holding those folks accountable.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Ross?
I'll offer some insight from my denominational background, which is the Evangelical Covenant Church. And our denomination implemented a process by which we need to gauge our anti-racist diversity efforts. And sometimes it depends on the organization. I think the Salvation Army probably falls into this category of communities that need some of these markers to help them further along. These kind of demarcation of like, hey, we need to do this to get further along. So I'll just offer these 6 categories that our denomination has used to mixed effect, but also I think it's been good conversation starters. So the first category is population, which means that for many of us to see in our cores and to see in our leadership, but also in like what we see in who's involved in the Salvation Army, looks diverse. But that's stage one. That's almost like the low-hanging fruit these days. You can just kind of reach out and find diversity in your community. So that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. But you should also start moving towards participation. So just because your community looks diverse doesn't mean that everybody's involved. And there might be obstacles that prevent some from getting involved and others from getting involved. You want to make sure that there is not just the population in front of you, but it's a active participation. The third category is power sharing, and I think both Dr. Cleveland and Dr. Marion has alluded to this. You've got to demonstrate through the sharing of power the ways that you are moving towards reconciliation and justice, because there is a sharing of power that is going on. The fourth is pace setting, which is that oftentimes when we're in communities that are so-called diverse, the culture is still set by the dominant group, or the culture is still set by those who've held the power for long periods of time. And can there be a noticeable cultural shift so that it is not the dominant culture that sets the pace, but it's actually those who have been marginalized previously, historically, that those communities speak out in a way that allows the pace setting to come not from those who've always had power, but those who've been outside of power. The fifth one is the one that I want to touch upon, according to what the major was saying about purposeful narrative. Now, as was said, I feel like an honorary member of the Salvation Army. I've been really blessed to not only have been involved in a corps in my neighborhood, but also just many times interacting with the community and speaking at Salvation Army conferences. I do feel really blessed by that interaction. One of the things I remember in my conversations is that there were some amazing stories within the Salvation Army. Folks who had these incredible narratives of how they got involved and the work they've been doing, and just kind of even multi-generational diversity that they've lived. And Major, you were talking about this, that there's a history there. And to really grasp that narrative and say, this is part of who we are as a Christian community, where many communities didn't do this. Can we exhibit that narrative, that history that shows this is an important part of who we are. It's part of our DNA. The sixth part is practicing solidarity. And this is the one that was actually recently added for us within the denomination. And this maybe goes to what Dr. Cleveland was talking about. When we hear the stories of pain, the lament of the community that has suffered the most, and in almost every case it's going to be Black, brown, and Native bodies who've suffered the most because of oppressive systems that were established, because of metrics and ways of doing things that have been established by a previous generation. When we hear those stories, we can't just rest back and say, oh, we heard the stories, we're done with it. We have to practice the solidarity that says now we're going to act upon those stories. And it's what I alluded to in our plenary session this morning. Are we hearing these voices? Are we hearing the voices of those who have been maybe the most hurt in some of our systemic racism, some of our systemic challenges? And are we willing to not only hear those voices and move out of the way so those voices can be heard, but also to practice solidarity with these voices?
Thank you. Just to give you a little of the backdrop, when we first started to put together this Racial Justice Summit, our first inkling was to call it a Racial Reconciliation Summit. And then at some point along the line, we felt that we weren't quite there yet, that was kind of jumping ahead, pulling the cart before the horse. And so someone has asked a question. It seems that the term reconciliation is often used as the goal or outcome in reference to racial justice issues. There is some confusion or maybe a watered down understanding of reconciliation. How would you describe or define racial reconciliation? And this question is for all three of you as well. Starting with Marion.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, I personally do not often use that terminology of reconciliation because, to reconcile was to mean that things were once okay. There was a time when there was no enmity, and we're trying to reconcile. We're trying to get back to that place. And so I don't often use that. The terminology that I typically use is redemption, because as I shared before, like I believe that all things on earth, whether it is natural or human in relation, needs to lead toward God's design for the heaven and the new heaven and the new earth. And so when I look at the book of Revelation and that transcendent vision of John, where he sees all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, that to me is the intended product that the Holy Spirit has long been working as an expression of humanity. And so I'm not necessarily trying to go back to any time in history where someone perceives that everything was okay. But what I'm trying to do is lean forward into God's design, his intended product. And so, and that product, I believe, it has more to do with redemption than reconciliation, any kind of returning to something. It's leaning forward into something.
Thank you. Dr. Cleveland, how would you define or describe racial reconciliation?
I'm fine with co-signing Major Marion's answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ra?
Yeah, ditto. I think the idea, especially of what are we going back to, is an important one. The history is not are we going back to the master-slave relationship? Are we going back to the owner, oppressor relationship? That doesn't make sense. The book that I recently wrote along with Mark Charles, a Native American activist and pastor, we wrote Unsettling Truths together, and one of the terms we propose is it better to use the word conciliation rather than reconciliation?
Right.
And Mark quotes in our book George Erasmus, who's a Native American elder, who's quoting actually Niebuhr, but he's quoting Erasmus, that says that without a common memory, we don't really, what are we doing if we don't share a common memory or build a common memory? And sadly, most of the memory is dysfunctional. And so conciliation, truth and conciliation, justice, those are attempts to build a common memory rather than being reconciled to an existing relationship that was dysfunctional.
Thank you for that. This next question is for Dr. Cleveland. And this came out of one of your breakout sessions. In your discussion, you made the comment, white folks and black people. Why was that the wording you picked? And do you feel it is disrespectful to do that? And then they go on to reference Morgan Freeman made the statement that race relations will begin to heal when we start to call people people instead of white people, black people, or Jewish people. Share your thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah. I'm always interested in affirming the humanity of Black people because our humanity has been trampled on in every single arena at every stage. And so I'm very, very, very particular about calling Black people people all the time. And white folks can be folks as well, because no one's questioning whether they're people, whether they're human. Mm-hmm. And I guess I would say I disagree with Morgan Freeman. I think that we all become more human when our particularities are welcomed.
Mm. Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. My next question is for Dr. Ra, and it kind of expands on what you shared in part one of your breakout session yesterday. What do you say to individuals in the church who take issue with the concept of anti-racism as anti-gospel?
Yeah, my position at North Park Theological Seminary and my work within an evangelical denomination, is specifically for church growth and evangelism. So I take evangelism seriously, the way it was described to us biblically and not culturally. And a big part of that is the confusion of a cultural Christianity's definition of gospel and a biblical definition of the word gospel. And so if we were to take a cultural definition of the word gospel, it would be, because it's coming out of a Western cultural context, it would be hyper individualistic, and not the way the scripture was written, but the way that society is made, and especially American Western society. So we think of the gospel as an individual presentation that leads to personal salvation. That's not the gospel that's in the Bible. That's the gospel that is an American cultural contrivance. Now, it doesn't mean that it's wrong or it's evil. It just means that it's incomplete, because we're relying upon our Western cultural values to define what the gospel is, rather than actually the Bible itself. And that's what's funny to me, is the very basic definition of theological liberalism is when you ask the culture to define you rather than the Bible defining you. So those who are defining the gospel in these very narrow terms are actually theological liberals, because they're viewing the gospel through these cultural lenses rather than through scripture lenses. So if I look at the word gospel in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, you see both and. You see the gospel as a public proclamation of the good news that Jesus is born and Jesus is the Savior. That's very clear in the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, the word gospel is used to describe the reign of God, which is not just a proclamation, but a demonstration. So when we talk about the gospel, we can't just say, oh, the gospel is saying the right words to get the right people to become and believe the right things that we believe in. That's our, again, social, cultural definition. The biblical definition is, yes, proclaim the gospel, but also demonstrate the gospel, in which case racial justice would be not an add-on to the gospel, but central to the gospel.
Thank you so much for that response. And I hope that people begin to look deeper into the term anti-racism as not something to say we're, again, flipping the script and saying now one group of people is to have preeminence over another group, but that this is how we actually move forward toward becoming a reconciled, a redeemed people, and using Marion's term. This question is for all three of you or any one of you who'd like to respond. How do you create a space where people feel comfortable sharing their stories of pain?
Yeah, I'll start. I think it begins with listening, sitting up, leaning in, attending to what people are saying. I believe that is probably the foundation of creating a safe space, is one where you are not completely insistent that you are the expert in the room and need to do the talking and the teaching, but you have a posture of learning and love. I think that's the first thing that creates a safe space. Like I want to understand, and I am the first thing that you need to know is that you and I have a connection, our humanity in common, and to build from there. For me, when someone listens to me before choosing to tear down or argue with me, they really want to listen and ask follow-up questions. That creates a safe space.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to that question?
I think it's in an organizational space that has that is rife with systemic inequality. I actually think it's difficult, maybe impossible, to create a safe space. I think that the systemic inequality needs to be addressed, and oftentimes when we create micro spaces that try to, like a bubble within an organization, the broader organization still isn't safe. And so we're asking the people to share their story in a way that requires them to be vulnerable in a way that it's not vulnerable for the dominant culture. And that to me is like an example of a crucifixion that doesn't lead to a resurrection. I mean, it's just someone just putting themselves out there, hoping that people can hold space. And even if there are individuals who can listen well, the broader organizational structure is not able to hold space for their humanity. And that by definition is not a safe space. And so I think the bigger question is, do we deserve to hear people's stories? Have we curated an institutional space that is worthy of these sacred stories?
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. Yes. Dr. Christena, from one of your presentations, breakout sessions, a question came in regarding self-care. And this is the question: how do we avoid or address feelings of guilt when attempting to practice self-care?
Now, we live in such a shame-based society, and capitalism interacts with Protestant work ethic to make us feel really bad for just taking a nap or opting out. I have found that theologies and spiritualities that affirm the image of God in me encourage me to step into that space where I can claim my own healing. And so, there were years where every night before bed, I read a bunch of Palestinian theologians who I think are pretty expert at being extreme minorities in an oppressive empire state and still connecting with God in a way that affirms their humanity. I read a lot of Black liberation theology. I read a lot of womanist theology, which is written by Black women, Mujerista theology written by Latinx women, just so that I could begin to imagine and envision my own divinity. And it's when I see myself in the divine, I'm able to see that even the divine rested on the seventh day, and then I can claim my rest too. But I think that's actually a deeply spiritual process, learning how to rest, because it requires that we deal with our fear, the expectations society places on us, the strong Black woman identity that those of us who are Black women have to live into. And so it's a constant practice, but it really is a spiritual practice. If we can connect, it's just a lot more mystical. I wish I could say, start with a 5-minute nap today and then work up to a 20-minute nap, but it's not that simple.
I think that's a good practice, though. It's something we almost have to learn, something that should be second nature to us. We learned as a kid that we needed to take these naps. And yet somewhere down the road as we became adults, maybe teens and adults that know that you might be perceived as lazy if you took time out to nourish yourself. And I appreciate your teachings and writing on self-care for that very reason, because I'm guilty of the need to break busy, and I don't do it often enough. This is a question for anyone to answer. Can you discuss the difference between racism and prejudice as it relates to the idea of reverse racism?
Yeah. I think racism is prejudice applied to skin color and ethnic assumptions about a person. I mean, it is, prejudice. I could be prejudiced against someone who, chooses to interact with the world differently than I do. So I've just, the etymology of that word is just to prejudge someone before I have any of the facts. I'm just looking at this person or interacting with them for a short period of time, and I arrive at my assumptions about their personhood. Whereas racism is more specific in my estimation. And so and I will pass a lateral pass to Dr. Ra or Dr. Cleveland to deal with the reverse racism part and add anything there.
Well, I'm a social psychologist, so I can add to that. I would say that, what Major Marion said, racism refers to race, refers to skin color. And I think what I would add to that is it also has a systemic power component.
Yeah.
And so I would argue that anyone can be prejudiced. I'll give you an example. When I was 11, the O.J. Simpson trial was going on, and my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, is a Black militant, and he sat all of his grandkids down. I was 11 at the time, and said, "See, this is what happens to you if you marry a white person." All right. So, he was telling us don't marry a white person or else you're going to end up on trial like O.J. Simpson. Okay. So, which I thought was, even at the time, hilarious. Now that's prejudice, right? Like that's prejudging someone based on the color of their skin. Anybody can be prejudiced. Would I call that racist? No, I wouldn't. Because as a Black man in America, my grandfather did not have the systemic power to actually systemically discriminate or benefit from the systemic discrimination of white people. And so racism is prejudice plus power. You have to have some of it in order to practice racism. That's probably the simplest definition. It can get a little bit more complicated, but that's probably the simplest way that I would think about it. So in that case, reverse racism is a figment of the white patriarchal imagination, because if racism requires power, then people who don't have systemic power cannot be reversed racist.
I like that, because some people will point to one-off events. Say you do have a person of color in a high leadership position who may or may not deal favorably or equitably with their people, and they may want to then use the reverse racism term, but I like how you said it's systemic, the systemic issues and power struggles and frameworks that's in play here. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I had
Dr. Rod, did you want to respond to that question at all? Okay, he's good. So as we are hopefully making inroads with respect to moving the needle in terms of increasing the diversity and inclusion and anti-racism optic of the Salvation Army or any church or organization, there's always that, it's not four-letter word, but that four-letter word that keeps coming up, tokenism. And so someone asks, how do you know it's true change and not tokenism? Anyone can answer that.
Let me pick up on the thread that we talked about earlier, the kind of the six-fold test that our denomination has been using. And so if you just have the population and participation piece, that's usually when you get tokenism. And I'll say, just kind of as an aside, and maybe kind of humorous, but not really, if I were to start a therapy practice, and I'm not a therapist, but if I were to start a therapy practice for associate pastors of color who are working in dominantly white institutions, they are kind of the worship leader at an all-white church, or they're middle manager at a denomination, there's a lot of wounded people of color who are operating in these white institutions. And, it can be lucrative. I mean, just caring for these individuals who have been so damaged. And a lot of that was because of tokenism. I call that the magic minority expectation. So they bring in the minority, and magically they're supposed to make more minorities. They have no budget, they have no power, they have no money to spend. But by waving their hands, they can magically conjure up other minorities. That would be kind of an extreme in tokenism, where you are, sprinkling your organization with one or two people that you give them no power, you give them no authority, you give them no budget, and yet they're supposed to do this incredible work that the whole organization needs to be doing. So it goes back to some of the power sharing, the lack of power sharing, the pace setting, the lack of pace setting, the lack of purposeful narrative, and the lack of practicing solidarity. So I think a lot of damage has been done because of tokenism. Because as Dr. Cleveland was saying, that's a really like a triple, double, quadruple burden that people, especially I would add to that, women of color are carrying, because you're carrying this excess burden of not just doing your job well, but representing your whole community, as well as trying to do magical, powerful things that nobody else is expected to do. So again, go back to some of these metrics to say, are we expecting this person to do miracles without any help? Or are we expecting this kind of power sharing, pace setting, developing a purposeful narrative? These are kind of the markers that I think would speak against tokenism.
Thank you for that. This question is specifically for Dr. Ra, and it kind of came in following our worship service this morning. You talked about one of the ways in which to become healthy spiritually was through muscle confusion, and how you kind of have to disturb the routine. In the Salvation Army, Catherine Booth is quoted as saying, we have to sometimes disturb the present, or not sometimes, we have to disturb the present to better the future. What would you say the Salvation Army needs to, what in the Salvation Army needs to be disturbed in order for us to have a better future for people who are Black and brown and Asian members of this congregation?
Yeah, so I think not shying away from the difficult conversations, which I think the Salvation Army is trying to do through gatherings like this, for example. You're not shying away from the tough conversations that need to happen. You're not shying away from hearing from voices that maybe typically you've not heard from. You're not shying away from, hopefully getting into these groups together and thinking through not only how are we going to treat each other better and overcome our prejudices, but also deal with the systemic racism. So I think you all are taking the steps, that I hope all organizations would take, which is to not be afraid of this disruption. And I think what I was kind of alluding to this morning is that there is such a bizarre, unbiblical narrative of triumphalism, exceptionalism, make ourselves great. That's really dysfunctional, because this is really not a biblical value. Because it says if you want to be great in God's kingdom, learn to be the servant of all, not, go out there and talk about your greatness. That's not how you become great, according to the scripture. You become great by becoming a servant of all. So the willingness to be in these uncomfortable spaces is part of that muscle confusion. And I mentioned that lament is an important space that can be created in the church, in the community, that actually not just a one-time deal, but a whole culture of lament. And that could be a part of that transformation. And I'm drawing my lessons on this from one of my mentors, Emmanuel Kotongole, who writes about this in the context of the Rwandan genocide and the need for lament as an appropriate response to the suffering and pain that is in the world. So lament is that kind of disruption. It's that willingness to engage in that kind of disruption.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to respond to that question? Okay, thank you. Kind of similar to that question, and anyone can respond to this, but this came in directly from this morning's chapel service. It can be said of the Salvation Army that it is guilty of white flight. How do we renew our commitment to city mission after having divested from the city in so many of our larger cities like Chicago.
Whew. That is a tough question, and I don't know really how to address it, because in our movement, one of the things that always happens when we talk about issues like this, do we want to be vocal, and how do we interact with social issues that are happening in the world today? There's a kind of reluctance to do that sometimes, and I feel that sometimes there's always this kind of writing on the wall that says, what will the donor say? Thinking about our donor, which leads to a deeper question: how will these things be funded? And so, when it comes to the Army being guilty of white flight, and there's some data to show that we moved away from the urban centers, to Dr. Ra's point about the city and how we treated it. But the question is, how much would it look like the Army for us to move back into the city? People have very firmly and well-developed ideas of what the Salvation Army is and does. And so when we say we're going to start a corps somewhere, the idea may be that we're going to throw up some bricks and sticks, and we're going to build a center, a Croc Center, or a building somewhere. Whereas, in reality, if we were to make it a more like a missional exercise, that corps may look like something that happens in a pavilion in a park or in someone's living room. And so getting back into the city, I think, is like most things. If you want to talk about returning to something, that is a work that the Army needs to do. Like, this is where we started, and we probably need to be intentional about getting back into the city. So that, I would say, is a kind of a return, and we would have to admit and confess what it was that drove us out, and what it is going to look like for us to return to being a part of what happens in the urban centers. So.
Thank you.
I'd like to add something to that as well. Thank you, Major Marion. I think this speaks a little bit to what I spoke on yesterday in my keynote, the ontological expansiveness of whiteness, the way that whiteness feels like it belongs everywhere, and the way that whiteness feels qualified to do ministry and work everywhere, and the way that whiteness feels like it can acquire expertise. And so I think a big question that the Army can wrestle with, it's an invitation to wrestle with, is are we qualified to do work in the urban center, given our history and given the current systemic oppression that is alive and well within our midst, that we're just trying to barely grapple with? And I think that brings up some really exciting lament opportunities that would be healing, and also an opportunity to address the whiteness within. Like, why do we think that we can be in those spaces and actually bring healing when there's so much about us that needs to be healed? We still carry this whiteness that is a sickness. And then I would just add, there's, in my opinion, the most beautiful, creative, resilient ministry and community healing work is being done in urban centers, in deeply under-resourced organizations, literally living rooms, people who are bivocational, trivocational in their free time are doing this healing ministry and community work. And I think, to speak to what Dr. Ross said, stepping away from that triumphalism, where bigger is better, and recognizing that work, dollar for dollar, hour for hour, is like 10 times more effective than the work that those of us who have the funding are doing. And getting connected to those like magical and spiritually powerful and explosive spaces. And instead of going in there and building another brick and mortar community center, just saying, why don't we just become a silent partner? Channel some of our resources to these folks who are way more qualified to be there. And they've been struggling to get the funding because they don't have the big donors. They don't have the time in their free time to write the 80-page grant, but we do. And actually developing partnerships that are indigenous to the community. And that's another way to just participate in the creativity of the spirit. You know, again, going away from this, like, we can do it all kind of like one-stop shop ministry. That's really it's a practice of whiteness.
Just to very strongly affirm both the remarks on this, and to be able to say that the work and the focus should be not returning to take over or to franchise the operations that seem to have worked in the suburbs. We're going to now create a franchise in the city of Chicago or city of Philadelphia. That feels very much like a capitalistic enterprise rather than a biblical one. Right. But as Dr. Cleveland was saying, especially about kind of supporting indigenous movements. Indigenous could mean more than kind of native communities, but it could mean those who've been in these neighborhoods for generations, who are doing the work that are surprising people in its effectiveness. So maybe one quick example I can give of this was there was a study done in Boston, I believe it was, comparing two churches' missions efforts. And the first church was a white megachurch, huge mission budget. And they had, millions of dollars going into the mission field. Now, most of that was to pay white missionaries to go into these communities. And what it turned out was the cost of educating these white missionaries, the cost of raising support for these white missionaries, education for their kids, and infrastructure needed, and health insurance. And I mean, the amount of money that was going into supporting like one family of white missionaries to go overseas was really, really large. And then they looked at another church that had a mission budget of zero. And then they compared this $2 million mission budget to a zero mission budget. But this mission budget, a zero mission budget church, was a Spanish-speaking congregation. It was maybe 100 people in the whole congregation. And they were interviewing him and said, well, do you do any missions? No, we don't really do missions. We don't have the budget for it. But then they asked, well, what do you do during the summer? And the pastor says, I go back to the Dominican Republic and I have meetings with friends of mine. And the last summer I went, I had meetings with friends and we started 5 churches during the summer that I was there. And then it turns out that those churches started churches. So they were tracing the impact of this $2 million mega church budget. And it was minimal because so much was going towards kind of keeping the mission enterprise going, versus the small church with zero mission budget. They traced it over a 15-year time period. They had planted 300 churches out of that one small church. So that's kind of the differentiation between, all right, we've got the resources and we're going to come back to the city and fix the city's problems, versus there's stuff that's going on in the city that is, under the radar, so to speak, but is maybe more impactful than what might be done with these kind of big budget, huge enterprises.
Thank you for that example. Because one of the questions as we were talking about the issue of white flight came up, what posture do we assume if we want to return to the city and play a role in community development? And I think that speaks to some of what Dr. Cleveland was saying about collaboration, indigenous leadership development, and then also the example you gave where stuff is happening whether we're part of it or not, that God is already there in the city doing what he does best. And We are blessed to be able to join in on that. We don't bring the blessing, but that blessing is already there, and we get the privilege of being a part of that in our urban context. And I think once we start shifting our mindset, thinking that, salvation comes on our heels versus it's happening in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of corners, then again, we have an opportunity to elevate and amplify the kingdom value of incarnational ministry and beyond that. So thank you for your response to that question. There was a question here, because I know we've been using the term whiteness, and so not everyone had the opportunity to attend Dr. Christena's breakout session. So they're asking, how do you define whiteness/anti-whiteness? And what are some practical ways leaders in the organization can leverage their power, their whiteness and privilege they've had to move forward together toward diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism? Anyone can answer.
I'm not familiar with the term anti-whiteness, so I'm not comfortable addressing that. But I can say whiteness is the cultural program of elevating white norms, white stories, white practices, white theologies, white ways of being, looking, feeling, over and above all others, and particularly in a way that's antagonistic to Blackness, in the ways of Blackness. So it's a program, it's a cultural project, and we see it everywhere. We see it in the media, where people who are white are seen as more beautiful, particularly women. And if you are not a white woman, the more you conform to those standards of whiteness, the more you're considered beautiful. So someone like me who has lighter skin, smaller lips, smaller nose, relatively straight hair, natural hair, is going to be perceived as more attractive according to the standards of whiteness. But we see it in education. If you're educated in spaces that are perceived or that were founded by whites, predominantly white, your education is seen as more legitimate than someone who's been informally educated on the street, etc. So I would say that's what whiteness is. It's like a cultural program that infects us all. Anti-whiteness, is that anti-racism? I don't know what that is.
Right. Yeah. I was just reading it as it was presented to me, but I had never really heard the term anti-whiteness, but I think some people, when they hear one refer to whiteness, that in their heads, they're hearing someone being anti them if they are a white person, but not the same, not equivalent.
That goes to what we were talking about earlier about this hyper-individualism. Oh, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, the hyper-individualism in American society, so that we can't see things through the lens of a systemic cultural problem like whiteness. That's a systemic cultural problem. And yet we reduce that to, oh, you're attacking me as a white person. So, I mean, there's a lot of kind of fluidity there and kind of confusion there. But I think part of the problem in trying to say anti-whiteness is like, are you opposing me as a white individual versus what Dr. Cleveland was alluding to? There is a cultural, social normativity around whiteness, which is different from I don't like you because you're white. I mean, there's a difference there that I think we need to make a kind of a distinction. And so anti-whiteness is not I don't like you because you're white. You're opposed to the cultural social norms that have created and made whiteness as normative, as the highest standard. That's what we're trying to address, not white person who is X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and if I can add something to that too, white people obviously benefit from whiteness because whiteness is seen as more pure, more legitimate, more valuable than anything else, and especially blackness. But as I alluded to in my initial response, a lot of us can also benefit from whiteness depending on how much we're able to contort our bodies and practices and theologies into something that is acceptable to whiteness. And so we all have to, we are all infected by it on some level, but people who show up in the world as white bodies obviously have to deal with it in this much more like integrated way, because it's not just about practices and behaviors, it's about just what you benefit from just walking down the street. And one of the things that I often tell my students who are confused, and thank you, Dr. Ra, for just pointing out like how often individualism makes us think, oh, if someone's talking about whiteness, they're basically saying you're a bad person just because you're white. Really, I had a student who asked, are you saying that I'm at fault simply because I'm white? And I said, well, not necessarily. I'm not saying you're at fault, but I'm saying you have inherited a fault. You're not at fault. It's not your fault, but you've inherited a fault because you benefit from these systems that actually make it difficult for us to affirm that Black lives matter. That's how powerful these systems are. So yes, you have inherited a fault, and it's your responsibility to do something about it as a white person.
Thank you for clarifying and expanding on your initial response.
Yeah, that was very good. Thank you, Dr. Cleveland. One of the things that I have found, and this is within the Army and within the culture at large, is that whiteness is not really used to being named. Like I see that happen when you refer to whiteness. Folks bristle at it, and as a person who is mixed race, when I say this, I want you to know, like, I'm talking about like my family as well, because the assumption is that whiteness is the norm, it is the standard, and to refer to it as anything other than that causes a bit of a bristle. For instance, I shared something a while back, and I used the term white American conservative evangelicals. And I started to get some feedback on that, where folks said I was racist. But I didn't understand that assumption. I may have been where they coined that term, anti-white, because but it was only as far as I could tell, it was a response to me using that term as anything other than a normative programming in the culture. And so I do kind of feel like, because people are not used to hearing whiteness defined or referred to, it causes that bristle, and that bristle may have the sensation of anti-whiteness because it's not something that they're used to recognizing. So I often think about that in terms of the toys. When my daughter was growing up, I was looking for brown baby dolls, and this is in the mid-90s. And to find a brown baby doll in Walmart or Kmart was a task in the 90s. And so the assumption then is that baby dolls are white, and that is the baby doll that all the girls want is a white baby doll. Or, again, the kind of imagery, I think Dr. Cleveland mentioned this before, is in the media, the way that media portrays humanity, whiteness is always the norm, and anything else is a minority. And so, I find it interesting that, the term that would be used is anti-whiteness when there's nothing anti about it. It's just an observation that it's just not used to being named. So.
Thank you for that. This conversation has been really, really enriching, enlivening, and I think all of us who are participating in this summit are just going to have to spend the next several days going through our own internal debrief and then maybe debriefing with others, because we're hearing so much new content and information, and maybe hearing something that we thought we knew about, but now have received clarity and some clarification on terms and words and organizations that folks approach the summit as if, oh, okay, this is about Black Lives Matter, when this really is so much more than that. But we want to acknowledge the pain of a group of people that have struggled. I appreciated Dr. Ra calling out those names. I appreciated the narratives that Dr. Christena shared yesterday about the individual in New York and the number of times he was shot because of whether it's hate, misunderstanding, whatever the case may be, but that a Black life didn't have the same level of value that would give you pause before you riddle it with bullets. And as a mother of a Black son, I have concerns, and I bear stress in my body as I think about every day when he goes off to work and then return home, what can happen in a short period of time. And that's not being hypersensitive or paranoid. It's reality today. And I appreciate my white brothers and sisters and people of other ethnic groups who now get it, why we are so stressful and vigilant, hyper-vigilant about concerns of when you're out in public, how you got to act and respond to things. So thank you so much for what you have shared in your prepared presentations, what you are sharing now, quite extemporaneously, because I did not share the questions with you ahead of time. And so I want to give each of you just a moment, say 5 minutes each, to just comment on or share whatever you would like to kind of wrap up this talkback session. Starting with Dr. Christena, then Dr. Ra, and finishing off with Major Marion.
Whew, thank you.
This is what I dream of, a captive audience. And yet in this moment, I'm wondering. Yeah. I think I want to leave you all with a benediction, a blessing, an honoring, because it's not easy emotionally to show up for this work, regardless of what race you are. And there, as I talked about earlier in my breakout session, there's really nothing in our society that supports this work. And I would argue there's very little in the culture of the American church that supports this work. Of course, we all know biblically there's lots of support, but that's usually the part of the Bible that gets underrepresented and undermined. And so I think I just want to invite us all to remember that we're all necessary for this work. Every body that we are in, each body, regardless of skin color, we're all needed. This is an all hands on deck situation. Everyone has a role to play. Part of our practice, part of our individual work is identifying what that role is. We do that in our spiritual communities. We do that in conversation with others. But there's no one who's excluded from this work. No one. and everyone has a unique role to play. And I love that we have a God who came to earth in the flesh to remind us that we can show up in our flesh and do divine work. This is not a nebulous, just out there, Father Sky God. This is a God who understands that we have bodies and loves our bodies and created our bodies. And we can each show up in our bodies and do this work. It looks different depending on our body, but it's all necessary. So you are the image of God too. You are needed, you are loved, you are welcome at this table. You may be invited to do better at the table, and that's for your healing, but you are welcome at this table. Thanks for allowing me to be here.
Thank you. Dr. Ra.
I'm not sure how to follow that up. Thank you, Dr. Cleveland, for the move of the Spirit through your words and through your gracious Spirit. Thank you. I'll just say as an encouragement that I spent 17 years in the pastoral ministry, the local church, and I've spent the last 15 years as a professor at a seminary. And I miss being a pastor and I don't know of many former pastors who say that, but I miss being a pastor because as a professor and being in the academic world, you spend a lot of time kind of tearing things apart, deconstructing and analyzing, and it's good. I like the work that I do, but I miss being a local church pastor that tried to build something good in that community that I was a part of. So as much as I enjoy being a prophetic intrusion into churches and denominations, as much as I enjoy saying words that might be difficult to hear and create that disruption at times, at the end of the day, all of you, many of you, most of you will be going into your communities to serve and care for those whom God has entrusted. And that's a building, a construction, a pastoring that I just want to affirm and honor. And yes, there are times when we deconstruct. Yes, there are times when we need to prophetic intrusion and feel uncomfortable. But there's also moments when you will go forth and care for the very people that God has disturbed your heart for. So I just want to encourage that don't just deconstruct, but go forth and do the work of building of the house of God. Do the work that God has called you to do.
Thank you. Major Marion, you get to bring it on home.
Wow. Okay. Well, first of all, I just have to say how honored I am to be able to sit on a stage, a screen, with two people that I admire so much. It actually occurred to me when I gave the answer about reconciliation. I thought, did I pick this up from something I read from Dr. Cleveland or Dr. Ra? And did I like totally steal their answer? Is that why they're co-signing? So I just want to honor you and say thank you for the work that you do and for your willingness to hang out with the Army and talk to us about uncomfortable truths. Listen, that means so much, and I'm so grateful to both of you personally and on behalf of my faith community. I also want to honor the leaders of the Central Territory, people whom I have known for almost a decade, and I love very much. I want to thank you, Commissioners Bailey, for doing this. Look, you've started something that has been needed, and you know it. And your bold and decisive advocacy for the Army in this effort is very important, and people have noticed that, and so I bless you for it. My fear, however, is that this would become a kind of token event. That we check the box and say, remember that thing we did back when? And look, I'm an insider. I know how we do this kind of thing. from time to time. We have a great experience that turns out well, and then we file it and we look at the pictures every now and then and say, well, that was just a great seminar. That was a great event. And I'm concerned for that. I don't want it to be a token event, but an ongoing cultural endeavor in my Army. The kind of the kind of discussions that have either started or swelled during this summit are vitally important for us to impact the culture of our Army. And culture changes hard, if ever. And so I just want to, again, honor the Central Territory, all of the leaders, Catherine, for the work that you've put into planning this and your team. I just want to say that I've dreamed of this for the Army, that the Army would assume some responsibility for leading this conversation internally and perhaps within the larger culture. I think that we have a bit of our legacy to reclaim. And so I am thrilled and anxious about what the future holds as a result of what we have kind of shaken up and popped open here. I want to speak just very quickly to my Anglo friends. This is not easy information to swallow. The things that you have learned or heard. I understand that this has perhaps been a difficult exercise, but I just want to honor you for hanging around and hearing some of the hard truths and leaning in and even taking a look at areas where, as individuals, you can contribute to changing the culture to something that reflects a more diverse, inclusive, active kind of culture within the Army. And with everyone else, especially my Black, Indigenous, people of color brethren, I just want to celebrate with you this amazing work that has been done. I do believe that something is happening, and today, as a Salvation Army officer, I mean, a major in the Salvation Army, I feel more comfortable, more heard, and more ready to live out my officer covenant today because of these conversations. And so, again, I'm thrilled. I honor my new friends, Drs. Cleveland and Ra in the Central Territory for hosting this event. Bless you, Catherine. Thank you for your hard work, sis.
Thank you so much for those closing words, all three of you. They have not gone out in vain. They will not return void. We do have plans to move forward with our aspirational goals and the outcomes that we laid out for this summit. And so at 3:30 during our closing session, that's when we're going to lay out what's next. What's next for all of us who've been participating in these 2 days of discussion, and those who, for whatever reason, could not be a part of the discussion. But as Dr. Christena has said, it's all our job. No one gets a pass. So if we are really wanting to do God's will, I'm reminded of Jesus's prayer before going to the cross, where he said, may they be one, because to the extent that we get this right, that we show unity in our body, others will be drawn to him and who the Father. And so we can't afford to not get this right. The very mission for which we have been established is on the line here. And so it's going to take all of us. And so I encourage those who are watching we're in about 15 to 20 minutes or so, going to move into our final breakout session. I encourage you to get hydrated, get some food in if you didn't have time to get some food because you really wanted to be a part of this talkback. Nourish yourself. Take that 5-minute power nap if you have to, but come back at 1:45 for the last breakout session. And then we're going to move into our closing session where we're going to wrestle with what's next for the Salvation Army in the Central Territory. And for those who aren't part of this territory, hopefully you take some lessons and some leading from us as to how you might apply what you've learned and consider what's next for you as you work and serve the Lord in your respective territories. And so I'll see you back here 1:45 in your respective breakout sessions and then for our closing session. Thank you so much.